Hello, hello. I'm your co-host for today, Dr. Carrie Jones, and I am so excited to bring on my good friend and longevity expert, Dr. Eve Henry. She is brilliant. She is Princeton, Vanderbilt, Stanford trained. She is trained with both Dr. Andrew Weil and the Institute for Functional Medicine, and she is clinical partners with Dr. Peter Attia. She has a thriving personalized longevity practice, and today we talk all about longevity. She is the one who taught me about the four horsemen, or the four horsewomen of the apocalypse, I should say. So she's going to talk to us about longevity through the decades. What do we need to focus on in our 20s? What do we need to focus on in our 30s? What do we need to focus on our 40s, our 50s, and beyond? Because absolutely now in this day and age, people are really starting to shift their mindset around don't just wait for perimenopause and menopause for it to fall apart. We have to start sooner. And that even includes if you're looking to become pregnant, the pre-fertility look. What do you need to do in your 20s and 30s? What do you need to focus on? Our whole goal is Healthspan. Our whole goal is to thrive through this longevity. So please welcome Dr. Eve Henry. Dr. Eve Henry, welcome to the Root Cause Medicine podcast. I'm so excited to have you today.
I'm so excited too. Good to see you, Carrie.
It is amazing to see you. For everyone listening at home, one of the reasons I'm very excited to have Dr. Eve on, well, two of the reasons. One, she is a very good friend of mine, and two, she is an expert in the field of longevity. And what we did at the Root Cause Medicine podcast is we kind of crowdsourced a bunch of questions around longevity, health span, aging through the decades, and we got some really amazing feedback. So I honestly can't wait to pick your brain as somebody who lives and breathes this information, literature, research every day. So I hope you're ready to answer some big questions.
I saw the questions. They're great. Your audience did a great job.
Well, first of all, before we go, how did you even get into longevity in the first place? For people who don't know you, maybe give us a little introduction.
Yeah, it's been a really long journey, honestly, with a lot of different twists and turns and excitement. But I mean, I honestly went into medicine because I'm so passionate about prevention. Like, how do you capture the vitality and health of being like 25 and have that last into your middle age and later years? To me, that's like the holy grail of what it means to have a vital and healthy life. And so that was why I went into medicine. And when I got there and I started practicing internal medicine, I did my residency, I was really disappointed by how disease focused the whole system is. There was not very much in terms of how we educate doctors around how to prevent diseases. I mean, if you look at how we do physicals in young people in their 30s and early 40s, we can offer a flu shot and some advice about like wear seatbelts, don't smoke. But really what we're saying is like, come back when you're 50 and you have 10 medical problems, and then we'll have a ton to talk about. And for me, that felt really not satisfying. And so I embarked on this journey of like, well, how do I find out more? I actually went to UCLA Center for East-West Medicine, and I learned about Chinese medicine. I spent time in India learning about Ayurveda. I did Dr. Andrew Weil's fellowship on integrative medicine, IFM training in functional medicine, and eventually ended up with Dr. Peter Attia because I heard his podcast like right when it first started. And I finally felt like, okay, there's like another doctor out there who's talking about prevention the way that I am. Like we have matched thinking. So for the last 3 years, Peter and I have worked together clinically.
And you guys have really set the way, you in particular, just being a woman, and given that the number of women that I work with who are entering into middle age. In fact, one of our questions that we got was, why does nobody talk about middle age? But when it comes to longevity, this is important at any age. I mean, I know we don't want to think about it in our 20s. I surely didn't want to think about it in our 20s. But how do you define like longevity versus health span as an example?
Okay. So lifespan and health span are the two terms that people throw around. Lifespan really just refers to like how many years are you alive on this earth? And lifespan is not that exciting of a topic. It's like a hard thing to sell because if you tell people, I want you to live forever, but your last 20 years will be in a nursing home when you're in pain and you're not cognitively with it, like that's not exciting. And that's not a kind of an endpoint that people are really interested in. I'm not interested in it. So the term was switched to be more meaningful and to talk about health span. So how many years are you feeling good? Are you interactive? Are you able to have a job, have a purpose, feel good in your body? That's the definition of health span.
When you're talking to people, how do you get them to make that switch in their mind? I mean, some people obviously have the idea that they're not actually going to live that long, or some know they're going to live long, but they look at their family and think, I'm going to be in a wheelchair, or I'm going to have chronic diseases, or it's inevitable I will be on 5 medications. How do we switch that?
So the question is, when does that decline start? So you look at centenarians, people who lived like 110, 112. It's not that they never get age-related diseases. It's just when those age-related diseases start. So in the majority of Americans, by the time that they're 60, they're dealing with age-related diseases. There are multiple medications. They have areas of pain, etc. If you look at centenarians, that point in time of 60 is pushed way back to like 85. And so they get a bonus 20 years where they're like playing pickleball, still working, going to France, like they have boyfriends and girlfriends, like they're busy. They're living their life longer in that healthy, vital time period.
When you in particular read about research centenarians, what's the difference? Like, what is the difference between the average American who comes to you in clinic and somebody who is a centenarian? What do we need to learn from them?
So that is an amazing question. And there's actually a lot of research going on talking about and thinking about that. And the bottom line is, I don't think we know yet. There's clearly a genetic component. There are some genes that have been identified that are associated with long life. You'll always read about someone who lived to 110 and like only ate bacon and smoked cigarettes every day for the last 25 years. And you're like, oh, yes, I knew it. A lot of it we don't totally know. For me, as like a clinician, what I focus on is actually not those edge cases, but a case that we're much more familiar with. So yesterday, actually, I was talking to a 75-year-old woman. And this is why pickleball was on top of my mind, because all she wanted to talk about was how great she is in this pickleball tournament, how she's just killing it. She has a brand new boyfriend. She has a trip coming up. She's working on a book. Like that is someone who at 75 is absolutely enjoying life. And that's my goal. My goal is I want to be that 75-year-old. I would love to be that 80-year-old. I would love to be that 85-year-old. I don't know how far I'll get, but as long as I can have, like as many years as I can have like that, that's the absolute goal.
I talk about this all the time. My family lives a long time. We hit the 90s without problem. And I love to travel. Eve, I'm telling you, I'm always saying, my husband will go, you're so disciplined. I go, I have to be. I have to be because the odds are ever in my favor, short of a bus or apocalypse. I'm going to live into my 90s. And I would like to do it as that woman you were just describing. I want to be traveling. I want to lift. I'm a carry-on traveler. I want to be able to lift my carry-on and not have to ask the person next to me. I want to be able to get up off the floor easily. I haven't quite gotten into pickleball yet. I can see that in the future.
It's coming for you.
It's coming for me. I want to do that. So let's start at the beginning, because several of the questions that came through when we crowdsourced this was, what do I do in my 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s? And especially for women, how do we age differently? And how do we pay attention to that?
Okay. So let's start with what to do in your 20s. Because I wish that someone had told me this in my 20s, because I did not do any of the right things. But in your 20s, if you are listening and you are 23, please go lift some weights. Please do some resistance training. So to me in my 20s, this was like the opposite of anything I was interested in. Like the only thing I cared about was being skinny. And so anything I did in the gym was only towards that goal, right? So I was like only on the elliptical for 35 minutes. I didn't think it was fun. And then I was out to do something else. Laying a foundation of adequate muscle mass is so important as you age. And there's also skills. Like when you first start weightlifting, you don't know what you're doing. Just like when you first start any activity, you don't know what you're doing. So when you have the benefits of youth where it doesn't hurt when you try to do things, like you're just so much more resilient, like that is such an amazing time to lay a foundation that for the rest of your life of excellent musculature. The other thing that I would do is more intense exercise, like high interval training. Because when you are in your 20s, that's not hard. You don't have knee problems. You don't have any sort of issues. You can just get out and run around a track. And that works out your heart, works out your lungs. Like you get to build much more of a strong physical foundation that, again, as these things decline with age, you're starting at a much higher level. Also, the resistance training is really key for bone mass, which just kind of highlighting issues for women. Like our peak bone mass is in our 20s. After that, we start to decline. Resistance training increases your peak bone mass. The higher that peak, the longer you have in the descent before you have a problem.
And we will get there too, because you were talking to me a couple of weeks ago about the diseases, the 4 horsemen, one of which being the diseases of frailty. So we will absolutely get into that. Okay, so now we're progressing to our 30s. We have a lot of listeners in their 30s. They're not quite perimenopausal, but they can see it on the horizon. And even though maybe they're considering other aspects of their hormones, such as fertility, they still know, oh my gosh, given social media and the education we have nowadays, I do need to be prepared in my 30s for what comes in my 40s. So let's start with that decade.
So in your 30s, what I would layer in as a focus is metabolic health. So by the time you're in your 30s, you have lost just a touch of that resiliency of your 20s. So in your 20s, you can kind of live on the beer and pizza diet for a long time and not have too many problems. That goes out the window by 35. By 35, that diet does not fly anymore. You will start to gain weight and you will start having metabolic abnormalities. And because we don't do a lot of screening of people in their 30s, this is missed. So people can have prediabetes, they can have elements of insulin resistance, and they won't know. It's not something necessarily that you feel. Maybe you feel some fatigue, but there's so much going on in life, it's hard to pinpoint. That you can pick up on blood work. So your 30s is when now it's time to be getting some blood work. Now it's time to be screening and knowing what your personal risks are and starting to really pay attention to your metabolic health, your diet. At that point, you're probably at a desk. You probably have a job. So your overall movement has decreased and you have to start paying attention.
When you talk about metabolic health, what does that mean to you? It's like if somebody's listening to this for the first time, they understand glucose. They understand weightlifting, but to tie that in with weight, beer, pizza, and metabolic health, what does that mean?
Metabolic health is a huge term, but what I'm really focusing in on is how you are metabolizing and using your glucose that you get from your diet. So you eat your glucose, that's carbohydrates, that's sugar. Your body produces insulin to get it used, and it's taken up by the muscles. So it's actually a pretty complicated system. There's a lot of levers to pull in terms of more muscle gives you better glucose disposal. Eating less glucose gives you less that you have to move around and burn. And there's often very subtle patterns of dysregulation in that cycle where we eat more than we burn off, or we're just not having these hungry muscles. So it sits around for a long time and can cause problems in our vasculature, etc. So that's what I'm talking about, this glucose regulation system. And that's what, again, you just walk up to a 35-year-old, you won't necessarily know if there are any issues. There has to be some evaluation to figure that out. Blood work is the easy way to do it. CGMs are now becoming available direct to consumer. That's an amazing way to do it. So there's a lot of options.
CGM for everyone is a continuous glucose monitor, the kind that goes in the arm. Do you use one regularly yourself or recommend them for patients?
I recommend them all the time. I do use one regularly too. So when you think about continuous glucose monitors, so what they're monitoring is basically a proxy for your blood glucose. It's this interstitial glucose, and it gives you an estimate of what's going on in your blood at that moment. Okay. There's 2 phases when you use them that are very valuable. First is the insight phase where you're eating things and you're getting feedback. And you're saying, wow, I just ate that ice cream and it turns out my blood sugar is now 200. This is bad. Or even when I did it, I found out that rice, which I've always just culturally thought of as a very healthy thing. My mom made brown rice all the time growing up. I would eat a tremendous amount of brown rice and my glucose would spike really, 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 really high. And that was shocking to me. I just had never thought that was a thing. The second phase that could be very valuable is in maintenance, in trying to stay on the wagon. So what I find with myself is that the problem is not that I don't know what works for my body and what to eat. The problem is that I make bad choices. I'll go out to lunch and I'll be like, that sandwich sounds amazing. And even though I know that 2 huge slices of bread like doesn't actually work for me, I'll just make that choice. The continuous glucose monitor is like your mom giving you feedback. So it starts to beep about an hour after you eat the sandwich. And then you're like, oh yeah, I shouldn't have done that. Mm-hmm. And sometimes when I'm wearing it, I just happen to behave better. It's like, I don't want to see the spike. I don't want to hear it beep. And so I'll subtly change my behavior. So I use it like that as a babysitter.
When I use one, I found out I was always taught and believed and thought sweet potatoes were really good for me. Now, sweet potatoes are wonderful in general. I am not vilifying sweet potatoes at all. And I still love sweet potatoes. However, I found out the whole family, whether it's the regular sweet potato, the yam, or the Japanese sweet potato that are purple, my blood sugar went through the roof, more so than a regular potato. And I thought, no, I love the sweet potato family. So that was really great feedback for me. And I've learned, yes, a lot of other people have that reaction, but a lot of people don't. Like I would compare with a lot of other people who go, nope, regular potatoes or white rice might send me through the roof, but I have no bump with a purple Japanese sweet potato. I'm like, I'm in the 175, 200. Now, the other thing I would use it is for as well. So speaking of women's health, is I become, as most women do, more insulin resistant in my luteal phase. So in the second half of my cycle, and I would see that on the continuous glucose monitor. For me, being in the second half of my cycle, it was more motivating, even if I craved all things chocolate, of knowing the changes in my hormones are actually pushing me more metabolically to be problematic. And so then I would make better decisions, which would, of course, help my hormones, stabilize my mood, improve my sleep, energy, improve the whole thing. But I could see it. I could see my blood sugar, especially fasting or my like just sort of higher than it was a week ago. And I was like, oh, stupid hormones. I knew what it was doing, but still.
I think that there's so much power in having access to your own data. I mean, that's like one of my core beliefs is that when you empower people to know things about themselves, then they can make really powerful behavioral change. Like just using that example, one of the most profound things for me is that if I'm stressed or if I'm sleep deprived, my CGM data goes crazy. I become a completely different person. Like normally I can tolerate, let's say, a small amount of pasta and I'm fine. A really stressful day or a day after I have a terrible night of sleep, my blood sugar will double what I would expect. So I'm not the same person every day when it comes to what I can tolerate. And learning that about myself and then changing just what I do on any given Tuesday has been really powerful.
So speaking of stress and sleep, will you explain that mechanism to people? Because it's so underrated and it's so common. What does stress and lack of sleep do to somebody's blood sugar?
Well, it's complicated. The short version is that it raises your blood sugar. And it does it through cortisol and a lot of the adrenal hormones. So basically, if you just kind of like think about it from a very high level, if you go into a fight or flight situation, the body is basically trying to mobilize glucose, right? Because like think about the line and you see the line, you need to run, you don't want it to be eaten. So you need a lot of glucose to put all of your muscles to your brain, et cetera, as fast as possible. But if it's not a line, if it's just like a nasty email from your boss, then you're just sitting there with glucose everywhere and you're not using it because you're not actually running across the Sahara Desert. You're literally stuck in your chair, sweating and being very anxious. And that every day over time increases your average blood sugar. It's all of these exposures. And sleep does the same thing. So when you're going into a day when you had really bad sleep the night before, it's the same thing. You're kind of primed for this fight or flight reaction to all the things that happen in your day.
I give this example. I've given it on the podcast before, but I think it's a good reminder. I had a CGM in my arm and I happened to get a really crappy text message as I was leaving to run errands. My emotional state went right to a 10, but I had checked my CGM and I was in the 80s, it was fine. And then it happened. So I got in the car, drove 20 minutes to wherever I was going, probably Target. And I was out loud having the conversation as if the person I was fighting back, right? I was yelling, I was upset, I was mad, I was determining how I was going to respond to this text. And 20 minutes later, when I got to where I was going, my blood sugar had shot up. To your point, for everyone listening, just my body thought, lion, lion. She's angry. Her heart rate has gone up. She's yelling in the car. Like, we're on the move, except we were driving.
Except you're seated.
Right. So we need to give her a bunch of glucose to fight this lion. And the lion was just an angry text message. And that was a massive wake up call to me on my emotional state reaction and what it does to my blood sugar. It's also, I'm glad if I really ever, God forbid, do see a lion.
You're ready to go.
I'm ready.
It works. It works really well.
It does. But I need to figure out a way somehow that we can differentiate lion versus text message, like actual threat versus not actual threat.
I mean, that is so hard and like such a huge problem for, I think, all of us humans, because we are evolutionarily designed to have this reaction to stressors. You and I talk about this all the time, but this is my whole day. You know, anytime anything stressful happens, my blood sugar is through the roof, my heart rate is up. And I mean, for me, the thing that's helped the most is meditation. If I go a couple of days without meditating, I get more and more into these cycles where I figure out that hours have gone by and my heart rate is 78, 83, and I'm just kind of in this kind of stress zone. Meditation allows me to pull back enough that there's like a slight distance where I can get like the front of my brain involved, where it's like, it's not really a line, Eve. It's just an email. Everything is okay. I don't quite attach to the response as much.
Yeah. I love that. I was just reading a paper yesterday about stress, cortisol, epinephrine, which is adrenaline, and how it essentially, for lack of a better term, shuts down our prefrontal cortex, which is the front part of our brain. And it's our executive thinking, our smart thinking, our think it through thinking, our logical, organized type of thinking. And if we shut that down, then what do we default to? We default to spinning out of control about whatever our stress is or what have you, and how whatever you can do to get yourself back into the rest and digest, relax, heal type of state will open the prefrontal cortex up to you again. And now you can focus, think clearly, make good decisions, be more organized. And I thought, if we weren't taught this in our 20s or our teens, how helpful would that have been on stress regulation?
Completely. I mean, I think about this all the time as a parent, because you can see it so obviously in children that when they're in a tantrum, when they're in fight or flight, like there is no logic. There is no discussion. You cannot penetrate that zone. The front of their brain is completely off. And it took me years as a parent to really get that, there is no point in really trying to talk in that moment, that really I have to let them calm down. And then we were talking about this last night, me and my husband, how we even see that in ourselves, that sometimes we get locked into those places and you forget that, like, when the emotions are that high, like the front of your brain is not online. Like, you need to just take a moment.
My husband, who's very logical, will start logically talking to me. And as I said to you earlier, I'm like, you just have to let me be dramatic. You just have to let me.
Just wave.
I will come back to logic in a minute. I am not there yet. Okay, so now we've gone from our 30s to our 40s, and woo, that's a big transition. Specifically for women, I do want to focus on women here. What advice would you give for the health span, longevity? What do we need to be doing?
Yeah. So in the 40s, I think about two things primarily. So one thing I want to say is all of this stacks. So all of the resistance training, the cardiovascular exercise, the sleep, the metabolic, all of that continues on. You never get to like forget about that. It only gets more important. But with each advancing decade, there's more and more to think about. You know, in your 20s, you don't, I mean, it's great if you could think about metabolic health in your 20s, but really you have a lot of built-in resilience. So it's your 30s that you start to hit some more trouble. You can have hormonal problems in your 30s, but by the time you're in your 40s, that's when the majority of people start for the first time really needing to think about their hormonal health as women. So the early 40s. The other thing that clicks in 40s that, you know, I talk about with women think about is cardiovascular risk. And that's twofold. One is cardiovascular risk is something that increases with age. So every decade you're on Earth, you have this risk of accumulating plaque. And every decade, like, the plaque risk increases in terms of at some point you start to have measurable plaque and get risk of cardiovascular disease, such as having a heart attack. By the time you're in your 40s, many people already have detectable, measurable plaque. In terms of medications and options, a lot of the medications and options for controlling your cholesterol really do not combine well with your fertile years. Like those are not things you can take when you're pregnant or breastfeeding. And so I don't tend to really dive into that in their 30s unless that chapter of their life has closed. When you get into your 40s, if that chapter of your life is over and you're really ready just to kind of focus on you're not sharing your body anymore, that is when I start to say like, okay, what is your cardiovascular risk? What is your family history? What's your baseline cholesterol? Do we need to do any imaging to see if you've already laid down plaque? And what are we going to do about it? And then I also say, well, like, where are you with your hormones? Are you having symptoms of perimenopause? Like, let's get things checked. Let's say, figure out where you are. What's your cycle doing? Because that decade, 40 to 50, those two things really start to come into play. 40s to 50s is really, for many women, perimenopause into menopause, and then kind of the start of cardiovascular disease.
When you are thinking about lab work, let's give some basics for everyone. What are some keynote labs women should be writing down? I mean, maybe everybody, men and women, should be writing down to assess that risk in their 40s.
Okay. So for cardiovascular risk, an ApoB is a fantastic test to get. Okay. It's not expensive. It's a single marker that gives you an excellent prediction of your future cardiovascular risk. It is very similar, but not identical to LDL. It's just more tightly correlated with actual risk, and I prefer it. I tend to order a fasting lipid panel, so HDL, triglycerides, LDL, and an ApoB. I get a high sensitivity CRP to see if there's any background inflammation. Get a lot of metabolic markers. So I'm looking at hemoglobin A1C, fasting insulin, fasting glucose. What are people's liver enzymes? What's their GGT? Then vitamin markers, hormone markers, thyroid, checking iron stores. So important, especially as you get towards perimenopause, women start to get really low on iron.
And that's ferritin. For everyone listening, ferritin. Okay, so ApoB, sometimes called apolipoprotein B. Your lipids, everyone's familiar with the lipids. Probably everybody's had a cholesterol panel at some point. HSCRP, that's C-reactive protein. You got your glucose as part of your metabolic panel. I'm sure everybody's had a comprehensive metabolic panel that does include some of the liver enzymes she talked about, AST and ALT. Insulin, you do have to order separately. GGT, you usually have to order separately. And then you will have to request hormones and thyroid. And with thyroid, what markers do you prefer there?
So if you can get nothing but a TSH is valuable. If you can get more, I really find a free T4, free T3, and sometimes a reverse T3 helpful. I also have a very low threshold to seeing if someone has antithyroid antibodies, because a lot of times there'll be very subtle signs of dysfunctions, and then antibodies are present and kind of on the rise, and you can kind of look forward into the future a little bit and know how closely you need to watch what's going on.
Okay. And then do you do vitamin D?
I do. So for vitamin markers, I look at vitamin D. I do a few B vitamin markers. So I look at serum B12, methylmalonic acid, RBC folate, someone's homocysteine. That gives me a pretty good look. I will often get an RBC magnesium, although sometimes I just give people magnesium and say, forget the test. But that's helpful if you really need to check things out.
One of the things I do want you to talk to, especially as it relates to hormones, is sometimes a lot of times I've had women say, I asked my doctor for hormones. I got a complete workup. Here's my lab work. And they come in with a complete blood count, CBC. So red and white blood cells. They come back in with that metabolic panel, and they come in with a lipid panel. And they're like, see, it's all normal. Maybe they have a TSH. And I'm like, ooh, none of that. Very helpful. Very helpful. That's not what we mean by hormones. Can you define, men and women, what do you look for in hormones, especially when they hit their 40s and you're trying to evaluate that?
Okay. So huge caveat with women in their 40s. Is that when you're in perimenopause, I always tell women that every cycle is its own unique individual snowflake. You can have such dramatic changes cycle to cycle in the way your hormones look in blood work that one cycle you can look 27 and everything is amazing. And the next cycle you can look 57 and like you're in menopause. So you have to take every single blood test in that time period as a bit of a grain of salt. Say, this is where I was for the February cycle. And you know what? The March cycle might be different. That is one of the reasons why in perimenopause, we really talk a lot about symptoms, because symptoms can be, frankly, more helpful earlier than blood work. Although if you happen to catch a bad cycle, not to use the word bad, but a cycle which shows dysfunction, then that's a clue. But you can see a totally normal cycle and someone's very symptomatic and you just happen to catch a very effective ovulatory cycle. So that's my caveat. But what I'm looking for in women is I'm looking at their estradiol levels. I'm looking at their FSH and LH, and those two are really key. I get total testosterone, free testosterone. I get a DHEA.
Do you do DHEA no S or DHEA with S or both?
S. I get with S. I do, almost for giggles, get a serum progesterone level, but it is like very hard to interpret. It doesn't provide me a ton of value. It really is very dependent upon where they are in the cycle. So that's the other part about blood work when you're in perimenopause, is if you get it in the middle of your cycle, at the end of the cycle, in the beginning of the cycle, of course, your hormones will look different if you're still cycling. So a lot of caveats there, but I do think, like, the way that I do it is I get very frequent blood work on my clients, and I'm always ordering their hormones on every single time. So I'm getting their hormones around 4 times a year. And that allows me to see things change over time. So what I'm taking a step back and looking at is, let's say I catch a cycle where their FSH and LH are over 20. Okay. So in a young woman, FSH and LH tend to be less than 10. Okay. So now all of a sudden I'm seeing something in the 20s. That's a little weird. Okay. Well, next time I get it, it's back to normal. That was just a fluke. But now I take a step back and I'm looking at a 2-year history, and I'm seeing a couple of times that I've caught a rise in FSH LH. I'm seeing a dip in estradiol, seeing a dip in testosterone. They're starting to tell me that they're not sleeping as well. Maybe we're now starting to talk about more anxiety, some mood changes. And now I'm like really clued in, like, we need to do something. This person is now edging towards pretty symptomatic perimenopause.
Yeah. Do you run the same or similar markers in men?
I run, I would say, almost 100% the same. I don't really run a DHEA-S in men. Sometimes I do, but it's not as valuable to me as it is in women. But I'm really looking for men at their testosterone levels primarily. Their FSH and LH provide some value in relation to their testosterone levels. And then the estradiol is helpful because it tells me a little bit about how their testosterone is getting broken down. Where I want their estradiol levels to be, sometimes I tweak that.
And then what about SHBG, sex hormone binding globulin?
I get that with both of them. So I didn't mention that, but I get that in remiss. It's honestly part of these order sets that I can't not get that. And it's used in the calculation for the free testosterone. So that is where that comes into play primarily, is how much of the total testosterone is actually available for use within the body. And that's a big part of it.
Okay. Now let's move into our 50s. Now she's solidly menopausal, hasn't had a period. What do we focus on?
And this in women, so just to take a step back and say, how do men and women age differently? This is the decade where it becomes really clear that men and women do not have the same trajectory for aging. So men tend to have a bunch of little step downs in kind of a slow and steady decline, whereas women tend to have one large step down right around the time of menopause, where all of a sudden they have all these new problems that are age-related diseases. And it can happen earlier. Like, I was talking with one of my friends who's in her 40s, and she was like, oh my God, suddenly I have insulin resistance. Suddenly my doctor is saying that my cholesterol is going up. I've never had a cholesterol problem. Suddenly I'm having all these frequent colds. My hair is falling out. I'm not sleeping as well. Like, where was this cliff that I didn't realize I was on the edge of, but clearly I have now fallen off of? Like, back me up, rescue me from the other side of the cliff. And that, for most women, is how they experience kind of, I would say, the first signs of aging, is that it's a little bit all of a sudden where all of these things start happening. And it's very closely temporally tied to around this perimenopause menopause transition. So usually when I'm seeing women in their 50s, like, it's gotten real. So now all of a sudden, a lot of times we have insulin resistance. a lot of times people have gained weight in the last decade through this menopause and perimenopause transition. I get a first screening DEXA if they haven't had one already, and we see where we are with bones. And we're doing a lot of lab work and seeing kind of all these potential problems, are we seeing any? Where are we? What do we need to keep our eyes on? And this also is where I think you have to like really get serious about exercise. It's like now there's like no more resiliency, no more joking around. Like you have to be doing weight training. You have to be doing zone 2 and doing some intervals and being really consistent. Like you just don't have that forgiveness bandwidth anymore.
Okay. And then going into your 50s, you had mentioned earlier with cardiovascular checking for plaques. What is your go-to favorite for having somebody evaluated for plaque formation?
Okay. So there's 2 tests for plaque formation. One is called a CAC, and it's like a really quick CT scan that looks at the amount of calcium that lights up. And then you quantify how much calcified plaque based upon this CAC. There's another test called a CT angiogram, requires some contrast, that can see the calcified plaque, but also can find earlier plaque, which is soft. So it's not calcified, it won't show up on the CAC, but it's there and it can be seen with this other test. There's a lot of reasons to choose one or the other that are very individualized, depending upon your family history, your age, etc. If you take someone in their 30s, there's very little point in getting a CAC because they're so young that unless they have some sort of very extreme form of familial hypercholesterolemia, like they don't have a lot of classified plaque, they just haven't been around long enough for that process to have started. They could have some soft plaque. So that's where I would consider CT angio if I needed that piece of data to make a clinical decision. By the time someone is in their 50s, I feel pretty good about getting a CAC because a lot of people will start to turn positive at that point, and that's really relevant data. The other reason why I have a slight preference for CACs is it's less radiation. You can get a few CACs in terms of radiation value before you hit the radiation level of a CT angio. And so I like that flexibility of saying, let's just take a quick check. Are we positive or negative? How are we doing? And then we'll check it again in 8 years and see what progress we've made.
What about like the ultrasounds that you see available for carotid artery plaques?
So those are helpful if they're positive. So if you come into my clinic and you're like, I have this carotid ultrasound and there's plaque, well, then I know your CAC is positive. Because if by the time you're getting plaque in these larger, visible plaque in these larger arteries, the tiny little arteries in and around your heart have plaque too. So to me, it's much less sensitive. Like by the time that turns positive, we have other problems. But if it is positive, like you don't have to go searching for anything else. Like we have a situation that needs to be addressed.
When you address it, high level, for somebody listening, maybe their CAC is positive, they've been told they have plaques. What do you do?
So there's many different levels of approach. From a purely pharmacologic standpoint, like a key element here is making sure that we are lowering your cholesterol to decrease the chance that further plaque is developing. So the kind of metaphor that I think of is I think of cholesterol as little ping pong balls that are floating around in your arteries. And they form plaque when the ping pong ball hits a wall and gets it. So to decrease your risk of plaque, what you want is the least amount of ping pong balls in your blood for the shortest period of time. So like if you've been 50 years of the high volume of ping pong balls floating around, that's a lot of likelihood that they're going to get stuck in walls, right? So you want to decrease the number of balls as soon as possible to decrease your chance. If we know that you already have plaque, you've already had balls get into the walls, then we want to push that number of balls way, 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 way down to decrease the risk of any further plaque accumulation. Okay? And there's a lot of ways, just to go back to cardiovascular risk a little bit and labs, there's a lot of ways to help pick out how high risk you are, right? So there's your baseline cholesterol. So there's your ApoB. That can put you in a percentile to say, are you in the 90th percent of the population for cholesterol, or do you have naturally low cholesterol? There's a test called Lp(a), which I forgot to mention earlier, but it's something I actually get on every single one of my clients at least once. This is a genetic risk factor for cardiovascular disease. It is a little addition to the particle. Going back to my ping pong metaphor, it's something that sticks on the ping pong ball that makes it more likely to get stuck in the wall. I think of it like a little sticky hand. So it makes you more likely to hit and go in. If someone has that, I'm more worried, even with a pretty normal cholesterol level. And then there's also family history. If you come in and you say, no one's ever had a heart attack in my family, that's a very different story than all of my uncles have had a heart attack. So I use those factors in part to decide how aggressive I'm going to be with lowering someone's cholesterol. And then if I have plaque, then it's kind of like a proven scenario. It's like, okay, well, it's here. So now I would consider using medications to lower someone's cholesterol.
And how does inflammation play into this? Like if somebody is diabetic, pre-diabetic, if somebody has been living a very high inflammatory diet type life, high stress life, not sleeping, which is not uncommon with a lot of the people we see or maybe listening, what role does that play?
It plays a really big role. It's honestly hard to quantify. So we know that you have to have a certain amount of cholesterol in order to develop cardiovascular disease. Like you have to have the ping pong ball. The piece that's not obvious, where it gets a lot more complicated, is why to some people, the ping pong balls seem way more likely to get stuck in the wall than other people. Like the balls are the same amount, but here we have someone where they seem to have all found their way in, and we get someone where they did not. I mentioned LPA as a factor, but blood sugar, stress, blood pressure, hypertension really seems to increase the risk of these balls getting into the wall. All of these factors help build this case towards plaque. And they're really, really important. So that's why I get the high sensitivity CRP. That is one of the many reasons that we pay such close attention to blood sugar. I mean, there's 1,000 reasons, but one of them is the predisposition to cardiovascular risk. And then there's like the parts that are hard to quantify, like the sitting at your desk all day, the not moving your body, the chronic stress, the lack of sleep. All of these things add up to this background. And we could use the word like pro-inflammatory, although I think it's a little non-specific, but this kind of lifestyle milieu that kind of increases your risk for all these age-related diseases.
So speaking of age-related, we've gone through 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. Now, obviously, do you do anything different as we get into 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s? Or now it's take everything that we just talked about, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, continue to apply it and monitor?
You definitely have to continue to apply it, but there are some tweaks and there are some problems that tend to develop. So one tweak, this is just an example, but as you age, you need more protein. So that's like a dietary recommendation that I worry a lot more about someone who's 65, how much protein they're eating, than someone who's 35, how much protein they're eating. You tend to lose muscle mass, lose cardiorespiratory fitness, lose bone mass. All these things you're suddenly really fighting against in your 60s. And so you have to be way more ready for that battle. So you have to pay way more attention to what's going in your mouth. You have to pay way more attention to how much you're working out. And there's all these obstacles that come up. So this is when people start getting injured. So this is when all of a sudden you have a knee issue and now you can't work out, or new illnesses develop. They get a cold, it's harder to get back up and get back. So it tends to require a lot more of a relationship with a physician and managing these obstacles as they pop up.
Other than protein, one of the crowdsourced questions was, are there foods or food groups that you tend to recommend or have people stick to or like, especially as we get older?
So the two big food groups that I think about are protein and fiber. Those are the two big ones. So protein, because it's so fundamental for building muscle and for maintaining muscle. And in women especially, it can be hard to get adequate protein for whatever reason. Just in terms of dietary preferences, I tend to, when I do dietary interviews with clients, I'm more likely to find a protein deficiency in my female clients than my male clients, but obviously that's not universal. And then fiber. So a lot of people hear the protein recommendations and then basically go on a very low fiber diet where they're eating meat sticks and then cheese and then the chicken breast. And then all of a sudden, first of all, they'll call you and say, I haven't pooped in like 7 days. But also, there's a lot of downstream negative effects from having a diet that is so low in fiber. So I will often have people track those two things. Track your protein, track your fiber. Fiber, primarily, if they can get it from vegetables, is where I like to get it from. So kind of a classic thing will be a small amount of protein and a lot of cruciferous vegetables at a meal would be great. But those are the two things that I look at when I start to advise people.
And a lot of women don't realize that as we go into menopause, the decline of estradiol negatively impacts our gut microbiome. We are more apt to have more inflammation. We're more apt to have what's called leaky gut. We're more apt to not have the short chain fatty acids that such as, for example, butyrate. Some people may have heard of butyrate, which feeds the cells of the large intestines, reduces inflammation, etc. And that is not often talked about when it comes to gut health, women, and aging. So I love that.
And it's so fascinating. I mean, this is an area of interest of mine, but not an area of expertise. Like the science here is so complicated and so fascinating. I've recently gotten really interested in like probiotics related to akkermansia and some of the effects there and how this ties into carbohydrate craving, like how much of what we eat and our food choices are related to our hormones and our gut microbiome. And rather than this concept of like willpower has been fascinating to me, that you could actually alter your gut microbiome and cause people to change their food choices. It's super interesting.
For me, it's mood. I've always been fascinated by you can change your diet or your whatever your food choices are. And I'm sure everybody's experienced this, not even realizing it. They've chosen a certain meal and made them feel maybe more depressed, more anxious, more distracted, less motivated. And when maybe they went on vacation, maybe they were car trips, so they were choosing less than ideal choices because gas stations have nothing. And when they got back to their regular plan, they were like, gosh, I just felt so much different, so much better in the mind. I know how that's linked.
I know. For me, it's a feed forward and feed backward cycle. So if I'm really stressed, my carb craving, my sugar craving, like the dopamine hit that you get from those choices goes through the roof. If I'm doing great, then I'm like, oh, I don't need that, I'm fine. So totally different. And then I feel different afterwards.
Well, speaking of akkermansia, because obviously that is a probiotic, some people may have seen the ads or watched the research, or there's a lot of education out there. One of the questions that was asked was about supplements. There are a lot of quote unquote longevity supplements out there. Do you have any that you actually do like, or that a lot of your patients are on for supportive reasons?
So yes, is the short. And I think sometimes it's surprising how basic, like the fundamental supplements that I love are very basic and not necessarily fancy, but like vitamin D for everyone. There's so much research on vitamin D. I just retook my integrative medicine boards and it was like a joke. Every chapter is like, what should you do about this problem? You should take vitamin D. Next chapter. Also vitamin D. So there's just unbelievable amounts of benefits there. Magnesium, same thing. There's unbelievable amounts of research in terms of cognitive protection, GI health, muscle health. So magnesium for all people. And then B vitamins. Again, a tremendous amount of research on some of the negative effects in terms of cognition as you age with lower B vitamin levels. It's really important. So if I could only pick three, if I was like, I can only take 3 supplements, I would take vitamin D, magnesium, and a B complex.
I take all of those every day. I am Dr. Eve Henry approved. I love that. Well, one of the other questions I know as we start to wrap up, but I love this question. It's what are some hidden ways we unknowingly may be lessening our chances for longevity, and what could we do instead? Hidden ways.
Hidden ways. Well, that is a good question. So the first thing that comes to my mind is poor sleep hygiene habits, which is so easy in today's world, but like sitting on your phone and scrolling at 11 p.m. at night is devastating for your sleep. And without sleep trackers, you honestly may not know. This is like one of the cool things about getting your data is what you'll see is if you're up late at night, especially up late at night and getting exposed to blue light, your deep sleep plummets. that first half of the night that you're getting deep sleep, and then you move into REM, and it's not like it gets pushed back. You just miss it. And you may not know, although you may feel progressively more tired and kind of like not as good over time. That is like a huge thing that I see in people. The other thing is, through our 30s, 40s, and 50s, like we are working really hard. We are sitting in these desks all day long. And the amount of movement that we do is sometimes incredibly low. And to think that you can sit at a desk all day long and then get up and go to a gym and run for 30 minutes and then everything is okay, which first of all is my routine many times, so no judgment, but that is actually not healthy. Like it's so much better to get up during the day and go for 4 walks, break it up, get outside, get around your block. Moving is key and easy to miss.
All right. Last question, also crowdsourced, but ties into what I mentioned earlier on the 4 horsemen. So for those who don't know the 4 horsemen, Eve talked to me about this, probably a couple of weeks ago. So the 4 horsemen or horsewomen, I guess however you want to say it, all right? Sorry, would be cancer, cardiovascular, cardiometabolic disease, neurodegenerative disease, and then diseases of frailty.
Yeah. And what we're talking about here these are the diseases that as we age tend to result in death. That's why the 4 horsewomen came to be.
Yeah, which was wildly helpful for me in putting that context from our conversation to talk with women going through perimenopause, menopause, and men too. It just doesn't happen to be who I tend to talk with. When they're like, I'm having hot flashes and night sweats and losing hair and gaining weight. I'm like, yes. And we need to do something to, again, longevity, health span with the 4 horsewomen and prevent that. Like we need to have both things at the same time. I don't want you having hot flashes and night sweats that disrupt your sleep. And I have to think deeper and longer than that. But the question is, given these 4 horsemen, given longevity, what are your favorite practical, tactical, actionable items that you would recommend to everybody? And they can include trackers or diagnostic tools if we haven't talked about them yet. Like, should they get a tracker? Do you have a tracker or tool? We've mentioned a bunch of lab work. That one seems, check that box off. What else do you generally educate your patients on?
So if you can do nothing to try to fight this except one thing, that thing should be exercise. In terms of data, frailty, cancer, neurodegenerative disease, exercise is where you should put all of your money. Okay. If you have more money and more time after exercise, I would throw all of my efforts into metabolic health and making sure that I have no subtle insulin resistance and high glucose. I cannot say enough great things about continuous glucose monitors. And I think the fact that they're now direct to consumer and that you can use different companies to get them is really paved the way for women and men to have more autonomy and ownership over their diets, their lifestyles, and how all of those things are affecting them personally. As we talked about, people are so different in terms of what they can tolerate, how stress affects them. Like the more data you have, the better. I also think sleep tracking is really powerful. Now, sleep trackers are not perfect. And you can see if you get multiple, like if you have a watch and a ring and all these things, you'll see differences. But knowing and watching within yourself to see that, wow, when I stayed up late that night and I didn't feel good the next morning, look what my data looked like. When I had that second glass of wine, look what my data looked like. And that really helps change behavior over time.
Okay, and I lied. One last question, but it's selfish. In all of this, in this longevity, where does hormone therapy play a role? Where do you feel like hormone therapy plays a role for women? Men too with testosterone, but it seems more controversial for women. Men are easily given testosterone. Women sometimes have to fight for estrogen, progesterone, even testosterone.
I think it's controversial for both men and women, because I see a lot of men getting told that they shouldn't have testosterone until their testosterone is like so low that it's very obvious it is causing a whole host of problems. So my opinion on this, and this is just my personal opinion, is that a very key element of prevention is making sure that hormone levels do not get to that abysmal place in both men and women. There's a lot of data, just to use males as an example with testosterone, that as your testosterone declines, your rate of insulin resistance goes up, your rate of muscle loss goes up. So these are key elements of prevention. And not treating that underlying cause is very backwards to me. And it's the same thing for women. So as we go through menopause and our estradiol levels drop, our risk of bone loss increases. The brain shrinks. Like there's increased risk of cardiovascular disease. So for me in my practice and myself as an aging woman, these are things that I think about all the time and that I do treat, monitor, and think about from not just a symptomatic place of like, wow, you have hot flashes and that sucks, so let's do something about it, but also from I want to protect your bones, I want to protect your brains, and I want you to be here for another 40 years feeling great. So what do we do about that standpoint?
I love it. Oh my gosh. Eve, I could talk to you all day, obviously. We have covered quite the breadth of subjects, but to wrap this up, because I know people are going to want to learn more from you, where can they find you?
Okay, so you can find me on Instagram at Dr. Eve Henry, and my website is drevehenry.com.
Amazing. And of course, we will link both in the show notes. I just want to say again, thank you so much for coming on the Root Cause Medicine podcast today. Your information on longevity and health span is easy to understand, easy to digest, very actionable, which I'm all about, and can fit in a variety of budgets, which I'm also all about. So I just want to say thank you.
Oh, you're so welcome. It was so fun, Carrie.
Welcome to Root Health, the best place to order, manage, and track results from over 30 different lab companies in one single place for free. It's going to take you under 2 minutes to sign up, and you can order any functional medicine lab for your client in under 30 seconds. Let me show you how it's done. So here's our beautiful interface. I'm typing in the name of my client, selecting the lab that I want to order for them, and hitting send. From there, Rupa and their amazing team handle the rest. They email the client, collect payment, and even offer an interest-free 3-month payment plan. We've also built the world's largest library of information about chronic health conditions, the lab tests that can help you find the root cause, and the evidence-based interventions that you can use to help people heal from them. It's called the Rupa Health Magazine. There, we have in-depth articles about almost any health condition you can imagine. And we give you step-by-step protocols that other clinicians have used to help their clients heal and that are verified by evidence-based sources. You should totally check it out, and it'll transform your practice. And we can't wait to see you. So make sure you sign up today at rupahealth.com.